I'm Daria Rose Foner, Research Associate to the Director. When Belle da Costa Greene retired as Director of the Pierpont Morgan Library in 1948, after nearly a quarter century at its helm, her longtime friend, the art historian Sidney Cockrell, wrote to her, "Your long rule has been one of unexampled brilliance." Eric Millar, the British Museum's former keeper of manuscripts, declared the library a monument of your taste, enthusiasm, and wholehearted devotion to its interests, with which your name will always be associated. Yet while the Morgan today exists as a testament to Greene's vision, her role in creating and shaping the institution remains only partially understood. This brief presentation is one of several early efforts to redress this situation, a first step of recuperative institutional self-investigation. Belle da Costa Greene was born Belle Marion Greener in Washington, D.C. in November 1879 to Genevieve Ida Fleet and Richard T. Greener, the first Black graduate of Harvard College, shown here in a photograph from his 1870 yearbook. Greener, a prominent African-American public intellectual, was an educator, diplomat, lawyer, and civil rights activist. A self-described literary man devoted, in his own words, to art, books, and aesthetics, Greene had served as de facto librarian at the University of South Carolina, where, as a professor in the mid-1870s, during the school's brief period of racial integration, he taught philosophy, classical languages, and constitutional law. At the end of Reconstruction, the Greener family moved to Washington, and in the late 1880s, the family, which now included Belle Greene and her 4 siblings, relocated to New York, where her father had been appointed secretary of the Ulysses S. Grant Monument Association, the organizing committee of what is popularly known as Grant's Tomb. By 1896, when Belle Greene was 18, her parents had separated. Her father took up a diplomatic post in Vladivostok, and her mother, working as a private music tutor to support the family, changed their last name from Greener to Greene with an E. From that point on, the family fashioned themselves as being of Portuguese descent and passed as white, a facet of Greene's identity originally discovered by Jean Strauss. The phenomenon of passing was not an uncommon practice for light-skinned African Americans confronted by the rigid racial exclusions that defined Jim Crow America in the North as well as South. As Hilton Alls writes in the most recent issue of The New Yorker, passing constituted being a part of almost a third race, with its own rules of conduct amid the constant fear of exposure. Belle Greene's education and professional training during the 1890s remains opaque. In 1896, as I recently discovered, she was working as an assistant in the Office of Teachers College and submitted an application to the Northfield Seminary for Young Ladies, a school in Massachusetts founded by the evangelist preacher Dwight Lyman Moody. While it remains unclear if Greene actually enrolled, the unpublished letter written to the school on her behalf by the philanthropist and social welfare advocate Grace Dodge, who was aware of Greene's father's racial and professional identity, described the teenager as, quote, bright, quick to learn, easily influenced, and full of fun and energy, with ample brains and ability. By the early 1900s, Greene had begun working at the Princeton University Library, probably as a cataloger or clerk. It was there she met Junius Spencer Morgan, the associate librarian, and most importantly for the trajectory of Greene's career, J. Pierpont Morgan's nephew. It was Junius, an ardent bibliophile, who introduced Greene to his uncle and recommended that he hire her. When Greene began working for Pierpont Morgan in mid-1905, the McKim Mead and White building, designed as Morgan's private library and study, the architectural heart of the Morgan's campus, was nearing completion. Greene's initial task as assistant librarian was to unpack the many books that had been stored at the Lenox Library, located where the Frick collection is today, in order to sort and shelve them in their new home. Within a few months of her arrival, however, Greene's responsibilities had grown dramatically, and she was routinely corresponding with the most important book dealers of the day, though mainly to refuse their constant offers of items for Morgan to purchase. By 1909, Greene had been promoted to librarian, having hired her own assistant librarian, Ada Thurston. Greene now served as Pierpont Morgan's chief consultant on bibliographic matters. In one of the only overarching descriptions of Mr. Morgan's library, as it was then called, penned during Pierpont Morgan's life, Greene wrote on April 23, 1909, to the financier, whom she humorously referred to as her big chief, that she sought to make the library, quote, preeminent, especially for incunabula, manuscripts, bindings, and the classics. And while these are certainly the areas with which Greene has remained most closely associated, she advised Pierpont Morgan on nearly every aspect of his collection. In November 1909, for instance, she encouraged him to purchase Charles Fairfax Murray's outstanding collection of about 1,500 old master drawings for £50,000 or $250,000, which still forms the core of the Morgan's Department of Drawings and Prints, a purchase that Morgan had declined only a few years earlier, and which included sheets by Parmigianino, Andrea del Sarto, and Peter Paul Rubens, as seen here. Greene also advised on the acquisition of some of the most iconic works in the collection, including the Stabilo triptych, a sumptuously decorated reliquary of the True Cross. The year 1911 would prove pivotal in Greene's career. During that 12-month period, she pushed the boundaries of Morgan's collecting practices in new and exciting ways and burst onto the national bibliographic stage. Not only did she spearhead the purchase of a group of Coptic manuscripts whose restoration at the Vatican Library, cataloging, and publication would occupy her for decades, but also she oversaw the acquisition of the first group of works of Islamic art to enter Morgan's collection, 57 leaves of Persian and Mughal miniatures and calligraphy. As Greene wrote to Hercules Reed of the British Museum, from whom she purchased the albums, while Mr. Morgan himself is not particularly interested in Persian art, it seems to me that in a collection of manuscripts and drawings such as he has, it is very necessary for him to have representation of this most important school. It was Greene's purchase on May 1st, 1911, of William Caxton's 1485 edition of Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur during the first part of the sale of the library belonging to the printing magnate and renowned book collector Robert Hoe, a founding member of both the Grolier Club and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that thrust her into the national spotlight. She paid an astounding $42,800 for the volume, a victory that, as reported in the New York Times, evoked a hearty round of applause. She described her coup in a letter to the Italian Renaissance art historian Bernard Berenson. I bought the book I really had to have. I paid $42,800 for it. Morte d'Arthur, printed by Caxton, only perfect copy known, but did not consider this very high, as, had it not been that I eliminated Widener and Huntington, I should have had to pay close on to $75,000. JP had cabled me to pay $100,000 if necessary, and I had a very complimentary cable from him today after my cable saying I had bought it for half that amount. Greene destroyed her papers before her death. Therefore, the letters she wrote to Berenson, with whom she maintained a close epistolary and at times romantic relationship for much of her life, offer the fullest insight into her personality. While the over 600 letters are held at the Villa I Tatti, Berenson's former home in the hills outside of Florence, and today the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, we at the Morgan are in the process of transcribing them with the aim of producing a publicly available digital corpus. Greene's wit, vivacity, intellectual curiosity, and scholarly discrimination, not to mention Rye's sense of humor, all come through in the correspondence. In the aftermath of her purchase of Caxton's Morte d'Arthur, newspapers across the country ran articles about Greene's great feat at the Hoe auction, stories often accompanied by images of Greene herself, rather than the rare book in question. She bemoaned the publicity, writing to Berenson that she had awoken to a horrible vision of myself in the Sunday world, full page and brightly colored, while I had a dozen different fits of anger and despair. And although it said in the accompanying article that I was very quiet and self-contained, yet this picture was of half actress and half college girl. If I behave in a dignified way when attending to my business, why can't they treat me in the same way in their newspaper? Or better still, why can't they leave me out? Greene did not, however, always shy away from attention. She dressed fashionably and, as her letters reveal, frequented the most stylish locales and was often a guest at the estates of the very wealthy. Pierpont Morgan's death in Rome on March 31st, 1913, left Greene deeply bereaved. She cabled Berenson 3 days later, "My heart and life are broken." On April 12th, she wrote him on morning stationery, describing her state of mind. "I feel as one enveloped in a dense fog. I can neither think nor see into the future. Not even you knew all that he, Pierpont Morgan, was to me. Besides every other relation, he was a son and a father confessor. To have been so sure of his love and trust that I never questioned it gives me an inspiration for all the rest of my life. I shall be working for him every hour of every day to come." And indeed, Greene devoted her remaining 37 years to transforming the Morgan Library from a private bookman's paradise, as it was described in the New York Times in 1908, into a distinguished museum and center for scholarly research. During the next decade, Greene was largely occupied with the assessment and eventual dispersal of Pierpont Morgan's collection. Under the direction of his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, 7,000 objects were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and over 1,300 to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Hundreds of other paintings, sculptures, and works of decorative art were sold through private arrangements, thereby ensuring that Pierpont Morgan's collection remains visible at museums as nearby as the Frick collection and as distant as the Thyssen in Madrid. This work, coupled with war relief efforts, dominated library activity during this period, so that the rate of acquisition ebbed significantly, though Greene, now working with Jack Morgan, did make important purchases in the fields of literary and illuminated manuscripts. Greene's role changed dramatically in 1924, when Jack Morgan incorporated the Pierpont Morgan Library as a public educational institution with an endowment of $1.5 million and Greene at its helm as inaugural director. For the next 24 years, from her office in the so-called North Room, Greene, in tandem with Jack Morgan, worked to create an institution that, as she outlined in the library's first published review in 1930, was, quote, "dedicated to the facilitation of scholarly endeavor in its myriad forms." Chief among Greene's responsibilities remained overseeing the collection's expansion through strategic acquisitions. Indeed, during the first 5 years of the library's existence, over 5,000 items were added to the collection, including an illuminated Carolingian gospel book produced in Rheims and written in gold, Vendelinus de Spira's Latin Bible printed on vellum in 1471 in Venice, and a second state impression of Rembrandt's 100 guilder print, among many other highlights. Remarkably, Greene annotated nearly all of these acquisitions, adding bibliographic references, jotting down notes made by visiting scholars, and including questions for further avenues of inquiry, an aggregation of scholarship that Lawrence Roth, the longtime librarian of the John Carter Brown Library in Providence, characterized as forming a continuous, living record of the growth of knowledge, an intellectual and bibliographic framework that Greene was so essential in assembling. Beyond overseeing purchases and gifts, as director, Greene spearheaded a range of initiatives that are today considered crucial to the work and mission of research libraries and museums. She originated an active loan program, sending works to special exhibitions, both at New York City neighbor institutions and at others abroad, and routinely hosted special lectures, graduate seminars, and meetings of affiliated professional organizations as part of a robust education program. The opening of the Annex building in 1928 further expanded these activities. Over the next 20 years, Greene helped to organize and promote 46 special exhibitions, largely drawn from material in the institution's own holdings. The campus's expansion also facilitated the construction of a reading room, equipped with ever-growing reference holdings, numbering over 17,000 volumes at the time of Greene's retirement. She also helped produce comprehensive card catalogs based on author, title, subject, and iconographic entries. In this pandemic year, it is also worth noting that Greene championed what we might consider an early form of remote access to the library's collection. During her tenure as director, 35 publications, including exhibition and collections catalogs, scholarly monographs and catalog raisonnés, and reprints and facsimiles of rare material were produced and dispersed to museums and libraries around the world. And in 1935, the Morgan established a photographic department, not only to document works, but also to study them through infrared photography, an early foray into what we would now call technical art history. In all of these efforts, one of Greene's greatest strengths was her willingness, indeed eagerness, to engage and collaborate with other leading scholars. Chief among them were Hercules Reed of the British Museum, Sidney Cockrell of the Fitzwilliam, William Ivins Jr., the first curator of prints at the Metropolitan, and of course, Bernard Berenson. If early on in her career, Greene turned to such colleagues for advice, she would go on to champion their institutions, forming lasting and particularly important bonds with the New York City Public and British libraries. When Greene retired in November 1948, she had reached the pinnacle of the world of libraries and bibliography and become an authority on museums themselves, frequently consulting for institutions including the Frick and the Walters in Baltimore. In 1913, in the aftermath of Pierpont Morgan's death, Greene likened his, quote, old-time library to the home of the soul, a soul that she nurtured with the utmost of care over the course of a career that, in the words of Lawrence Roth, writing in the catalog of the retrospective exhibition held in Greene's honor in 1949, must be regarded as an act of faith, an affirmation of belief in the fundamental values, belief in life itself. Thank you.
So recently I wrote a long blog post on the Morgan's first curator of drawings, Felice Stampfle. So when we discussed doing this program, I thought, okay, what is it I really want to look into? And I thought I would investigate how the Morgan came to hire Stampfle, which turns out is inextricably linked to the history of how drawings and prints became their own department at the Morgan, and also with the story of how the Second World War impacted women in curatorial work. It also gave me the opportunity to finally learn more about two women, Helen Frank and Marianne Farley, who preceded Stampfle and who until now were only names to me. So this account is based on archival research, the Morgan's published reports, office documents, and most critically, oral histories from some of the participants. I benefited tremendously from a conversation with Sean Tully, the son of Marianne Farley, and from discussions with my colleagues, Christine Nelson and Maria Molestina. A summary of my research will soon appear as a blog post on the Morgan website with links to some of these oral histories and other resources for those of you who'd like to look a little further into the question. So as Daria said, once the Morgan, the newly completed annex building opened to the public in 1928, the library's activities and staff expanded. The collection of prints and drawings at this time could be consulted by scholars in the reading room, and the works were routinely included in the exhibitions in our main gallery. And initially, Belle da Costa Greene's expertise was predominantly in manuscripts and printed books. So the collection of drawings was stewarded by staff members from those departments as an additional responsibility during the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s. It wasn't until 1945 when a curator was hired to explicitly oversee the collection of drawings and prints. And that's when drawings and prints becomes its own department. The story of how that came about is also the story of professional opportunities for women in museums following the Depression and until the close of the Second World War, and a story of specific personalities forging careers and adjusting to circumstances during these pivotal decades. In 1934, Greene hired a talented and ambitious print specialist named Philip Hofer as part of the team responsible for printed books. Hofer was given responsibility for prints, illustrated books, and drawings. He considered himself an assistant director by the end of his tenure, and he certainly referred to himself as such, given the large role he felt he played at the Morgan, though his title is listed in the Morgan's published reports as Curator of Prints and Illustrated Books. Soon after Hofer started, according to an oral history he recounted 50 years later in 1984, he was at odds with Belle Greene. The two strong personalities apparently clashed, and although we don't know how Greene viewed the experience, we do have Hofer's words. So in his telling, Hofer blamed Greene's dislike of him on the fact that he realized, and let her know he realized, aspects of her personal life that she had kept private. And I quote from Philip Hofer, "Belle Greene decided very quickly she didn't want me at all because I knew too much. Not too much about books, I knew too much about her. I got to know pretty well about her and guessed quite a few things about her, and she wanted me out. She didn't want to be succeeded anyway by an assistant director." He may be referring here to his awareness that Greene, as Daria described, was a Black woman born Belle Marion Greener who adopted the Portuguese sounding middle name da Costa and was passing as white, a facet of her life that Greene was forced to hide due to the racist ideologies that underpinned the Jim Crow era. Asked what role he played at the Morgan, Hofer responded with a laugh, "I did what she told me to. I helped catalog the drawing collection upstairs, and they had Rembrandt prints and things like that. I did what she told me to do. Sometimes she told me to go away." After about 3 undoubtedly tense years, Hofer resigned from his position at the Morgan in 1937. His passion as a bibliophile led him to found the Department of Printing and Graphics at Harvard's Widener Library the following year. Hofer remained as curator of the collection, which relocated to the Houghton Library in 1942, until 1968, with a focus on the history of illustrated books. He was a particularly savvy and voracious collector of rare books and left his collections to the Houghton and to the Fogg Art Museum. After Hofer's departure, there was a need for someone to take responsibility for the collection of drawing and prints. William Ivins, who was curator of prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was made a consultant on the print collection in 1938. But drawings stored alongside the prints on the top floor of the 1906 library above Greene's office remained a collection without a curator. In 1936, shortly before Hofer's departure, Greene had hired Helen M. Frank to assist with the medieval manuscripts collection, working with curator Meta Harson. Frank also helped to oversee the reading room where scholars would study rare materials from the collection. Frank was a graduate of Wellesley who received her master's degree from New York University in 1931. She had advanced to become a PhD candidate in medieval Italian painting at the Institute of Fine Arts by the time she started at the Morgan. An excellent wordsmith, she also deployed her editing skills on the Morgan's annual reports. Eventually, toward the end of her 6-year tenure, she took on responsibility for the drawings collection, a reassignment largely due to a clash with the head of her department. Frank recalled her experience at the Morgan in an oral history taken in 1991. The atmosphere of the Morgan during this period was characterized by strong personalities and some curious office politics. And I quote from Helen Frank, "I think I made the great salary of $50 a week, which was quite fair in those days. I was sort of a special assistant to Belle Greene. I did all sorts of things like showing visitors around, and then I did some work cataloging the illuminated manuscripts. I worked on the annual reports and the press releases. I got to curate one exhibition, The Animal Kingdom, on which I had a great time. But the atmosphere there was very strange. I think there were about 9 professional people on staff, of which there were 3 pairs of people who didn't speak to each other. That didn't mean 6 people because some of the pairs overlapped. When I say they didn't speak, they didn't even pass the time of day. It was a very strange atmosphere. So Belle Greene at one point, sometime after I'd done the exhibition, which was in 1940, removed me from the manuscripts because the person who was in charge of manuscripts was very jealous of me. She was many years my senior. And Belle put me in charge of drawings, from which Philip Hofer had recently departed as curator. And I really didn't know anything about drawings, but I was just beginning on that when the war came. And as the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, concern was high about the safety of the collection, especially in Manhattan with its active ports and the fear that the East Coast, in New York in particular, might be bombed. Frank's daily tasks soon focused almost exclusively on packing the collection to be stored off-site. The Rembrandt etchings went to Oberlin, and here you see the Allen Memorial Art Museum where they were stored, and the drawings collection was sent to collector Lessing Rosenwald's estate, Alverthorpe, in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. Other parts of the collection were sent to Saratoga Springs and White Marsh Hall outside Philadelphia, as well as to other more secure locations within the city. Without a collection to care for, Frank lost interest and decided to leave. And I quote, "Well, here I was, a rather energetic young curator in my 20s, and not of a mind to sit out the war being the curator of a non-existent collection." Frank went to work for the Office of War Information and then the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. After the war, she ultimately followed her mentor from Wellesley, Alfred Barr, to MoMA, where she had a long and celebrated career as an editor. With the departure of Frank in 1942, Mary Ann Farley was hired to assist with visitors, help with exhibitions, and lend a hand with the drawings collection. As significant portions of the Morgans' holdings were sent to these off-site secure locations, there was still much logistical work to be done, as well as preparation and support for the library's exhibitions. Farley was a native New Yorker living in Brooklyn who attended Hunter College and obtained her master's degree from New York University. She had frequented the Morgans' reading room in early 1939, but we don't know the topic of her research since visitors were not asked to note that at the time. She was certainly known to the staff, though, after at least 5 visits to the reading room. Farley's focus, like Frank's and Greene's, was medieval manuscript illumination, and she had spent 6 months in Paris on a Fulbright scholarship before returning to New York. An essential member of Greene's small staff, Farley's salary was raised to $175 a month in May 1944. Her tenure ended the following year when she married Edward Tully, a captain in the Merchant Marine. Greene attended her wedding, gifted her a silver tea service, and Farley always recalled Greene and her time at the Morgan with fondness, suggesting that the atmosphere that Frank had spoken about had improved by the mid-1940s. Within a few years, Farley relocated with her family to Princeton, working at the Index of Christian Art and for Professor Millard Meese. Farley also served as a trusted translator for Charles de Tolnay in his writings on Michelangelo. Farley was at the Morgan as the collection returned from offsite storage and shipments from December 1943 until May 1944. Although the drawings were back on site, following Farley's departure, they again lacked a designated caretaker. At last, the library decided to officially establish Drawings and Prints as a department with a designated overseer. Other museums had already hired drawing-specific curators, such as Harvard's Fogg Museum and the Art Institute of Chicago. Now Greene and the board needed to find the right person to head the Morgans department. They would choose Felice Stampfle, who began in 1945 and led the department until her retirement in 1983. Stampfle was a Midwesterner raised in Kansas City, Missouri, who earned her bachelor's and master's degree at Washington University in St. Louis. Stampfle later recalled the advice that she received on how to enter the curatorial field, and I quote, "One of the places I interviewed in Kansas City, my own city, after I had my master's, the man said, 'The best thing you can do is take a secretarial course and enter that way.'" Stampfle rejected that path and instead applied to pursue graduate work at Radcliffe. In 1943, Stampfle enrolled in Paul Sachs' Harvard course, Museum Work and Museum Problems. In his course, which he taught from 1921 until 1948, Sachs trained a generation of connoisseurs in a range of fields. And here you see Felice standing at right with this group just adjacent to Sachs at his desk. And in a second photo, you can notice Felice's perfectly rolled hair there, and we see her from the back. During Sachs's course, Stampfle was strongly influenced by Jacob Rosenberg, professor of art history at Harvard and also curator of graphic arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Rosenberg was friendly and accessible, and she also preferred his calm, analytical approach to the more irascible and emotional Sachs. Rosenberg's focus was largely on drawings with a specialty in Northern artists such as Rembrandt and Rubens. Inspired, Stampfle chose 17th century Dutch and Flemish drawings as her field of specialization. One important aspect in discussing women's advancement in the curatorial field is the economics of graduate degrees and museum work. Stampfle arrived in Cambridge with a clear ambition, but without funding to sustain her during her graduate studies. In order to support herself, she quickly gained employment as a social secretary and au pair to Paul Saxe's daughter, Elizabeth, who was recently widowed. Not long after she began his course, Saxe awarded her a Fogg Fellowship, which finally provided her with financial support. He also became her staunchest supporter, even though Stampfle had a falling out with his daughter. As she recalled, "I admired Mr. Saxe tremendously. He didn't hold it against me that his daughter and I didn't get along." At the Morgan, according to Stampfle, the Board of Trustees informed Saxe that they were looking for a third Miss Mongan, meeting the talented sisters whom Saxe had trained. Agnes Mongan had been in charge of drawings at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard since 1937, and her sister Elizabeth Mongan was curator for the print collector Lessing Rosenwald. Elizabeth Mongan later accompanied Rosenwald's collection to the National Gallery, where she served as curator of prints. As a 1978 Washington Post article referring to Agnes Mongan noted, and I quote, "In a field ruled for many years by men, many wealthy or high-born, Mongan, who is neither, nonetheless attained much in her profession. So did her equally well-known sister, Betty." The same can be said of Stampfle. Did the Morgans board and director, after the experience with Hofer, see the model of the Mongan sisters, both of whom were respected leaders in their field, as the template for success at the library? Stampfle's take on her hiring was simply, and I quote, "I was there at a time when it was to the advantage of women, as many men were not, due to war." But it wasn't simply the dearth of men during the war that led to Stampfle being hired. Saxe wrote to Greene in 1944, recommending the 32-year-old Stampfle over other students who had applied for the position. And I quote from his letter to Greene, "Miss Felice Stampfle is a candidate for a position at the Morgan Library. I hope it will be possible for her to secure this position, for she is one of our best graduate students. She was a member of my museum course seminar and did excellent work. I found her to be a serious, conscientious, and first-rate student. She was awarded one of our best fellowships for this year. I felt sure that if she should join your organization, you would find her cooperative and able to do an A1 job." I can only think that in addition to her maturity and training, Stampfle's seriousness, focus, and directness must have appealed to Greene and the Morgans board. And just an example of something very personal, these are their boxes of things that were still in her office at the time of her retirement. And going through them one day, I found these wonderful little notebooks that chronicle her trips as she meticulously records all of her expenses. And here, a taxi to Kennedy Airport, plus tips and that glass of sherry, wooden shoes that she must have bought as a gift, as well as cards, the daily newspaper, lunch, dinner, and admission to the Rembrandt house. So it really gives an insight into this very careful, methodical, responsible approach that Stampfle took to her work. During her tenure, Stampfle was remarkably prolific, organizing major traveling exhibitions with catalogs that advanced the field with their scholarship. And I encourage you to take a look at the blog post I wrote on Stampfle on the Morgan's website for more about her publications and exhibitions. She also grew the collection significantly in all fields, making savvy acquisitions beyond her area of focus in Northern drawings. One of her first and most notable acquisitions, just 2 years into her tenure, is this large sheet by 18th century Venetian artist Francesco Guardi. Soon after, the pace quickened and drawings were acquired in greater numbers. She was aided in her strategy by the establishment of the Morgans' support group, the Association of Fellows, in 1950, and the fund generated by that association. In her first decade, she amassed a series of purchases that remain among the Morgans' greatest hits, including these sheets by Filippino Lippi and Henry Fuseli, as well as the sheet by Jacob de Geen. And her 1954 acquisition of this Pontormo sheet gave the Morgan a superb work by this elusive draftsman, so much so that the sheet served as the cover art for the Morgan's 2019 collection catalog of Italian Renaissance drawings. Adding to these professional accomplishments, Stampfle also oversaw the development of a new print room in 1959. The print room was a necessity at the museum, where she had elevated the study an exhibition of drawings, and it put the Morgan on par with drawings collections throughout Europe and increasingly in the US. It was in this print room that Stampfle mentored the next generation of scholars, including Kara Dennison and Jane Shove Turner. Stampfle's tenure coincided with the increasing popularity of master drawings in America and with the exponential rise in this country of dedicated drawings collectors. Her rigor and meticulous scholarship remain legendary, and it was she, as the Morgan's first permanent curator of drawings, that set the standards we associate with the department and which every curator since has striven to uphold. Thank you.
I'm Sidney Babcock, Jeannette and Jonathan, Rosen Curator and Department Head of Ancient Western Asian Seals and Tablets. It is my great privilege to discuss Edith Porada today, who was a leading specialist for Mesopotamian art and specifically cylinder seals for the second half of the 20th century. Just a minute about seals and then more about Edith Porada. Here on the screen are a number of cylinder seals. The largest is less than 1.5 inches. They're among the smallest objects ever produced by sculptors. The scenes engraved on the seals are only understood when an impression is made on soft material imitating the clay used by the ancients, as shown here with this seal in 3 views at the top and a modern impression below. This mottled gray limestone seal is among the Morgan's most striking seals. A male figure pursues an ostrich, here possibly representing the earthly equivalent of the griffin, thought to be the conveyor of death. Scholarship focused on seals because Mesopotamia is basically a floodplain lacking in stone. There is none of the monumental stone architecture or quantities of stone sculpture that attest to the achievements of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Therefore, the images engraved on the seals, to be understood, as I have said, by making a modern impression, represents the largest body of pictorial information to have survived from the ancient Near East and provide a unique chronological and artistic sequence for well over 3,000 years. The great collection of the Pierpont Morgan Library of 1,132 seals was assembled on behalf of Pierpont Morgan between 1885 and 1908 by the Reverend William Hayes Ward. Ward summarized Mr. Morgan's intentions as follows, quote, "It is the chief project, as I understand it, of Mr. Morgan in bringing to this country the written and figured monuments of the early East, such as tablets, seal cylinders, bas-reliefs, or statues, to put within the reach of American scholars the material necessary for adding to the knowledge of the world," end of quote. Such a scholar was Edith Porada, shown here in the 1950s in Austria. Although a daughter of Vienna, America gave her refuge from the dark forces that overtook Europe in the 1930s. She came from a background of privilege, where a woman's world was not in academia, and her path to the Morgan was by no means inevitable. Her maternal grandmother was a famous actress in Berlin and married into one of the most prominent banking families at the time. The Magnus family home was a center for intellectual life in Berlin. Her father was an Austrian and shown here in his World War I uniform. The family's name was Rappaport, but in the latter part of the 19th century, when it was permissible to acknowledge the contribution of Jews to the empire, they were ennobled and became Rappaport Edel von Porada. The name Porada was due to their land holdings in Eastern Europe. As children, this is Edith on the left with her father and younger sister Hilda on the right. And notice Mama is not in the picture. We'll get to that. Their home in Vienna was rather a grand affair. It was across the street from the Rothschilds, and actually the Rothschilds had a lien on the Porada home to prevent the building of an additional floor that would block the view from the Rothschilds' mansion. Notice the antlers decorating the room at the right. That was because it was a hunting estate called Hagengut near Salzburg that was a refuge for the Porada family and to which they retreated every summer. Edith and her sister, shown here, Edith on the right, both loved it and wore traditional clothes every time they were there as an antidote to the social world and political strife brewing with life in Vienna. Mother Käthe was a famous beauty. Her marriage to Alfred Porada was arranged between the families. When she first met him, this is around 1909-10, she was told to play the piano for him, and then as she left the room, Her mother whispered to her that that was the man she would marry. Katie became increasingly unhappy in Vienna, and particularly with the life at the hunting lodge and the endless, for her, talk of the hunt. She longed for the intellectual world of her parents' home. She gradually began to lead her own life and became a muse for poets and painters, including Beckmann. That's Katie at the left, and at the right is a portrait of her by Beckmann. She did the unheard of thing at the time and left the family and divorced in order to pursue a life devoted to the arts, and was devastated, particularly when Beckmann married someone else. Edith and her sister were left in charge of a governess. This is Edith and her sister again. Edith is on the left. And she was among the first women to get a degree in Vienna. She had an early fascination with archaeology and wanted to study the Aegean world. A cousin of her mother's was an academic and told her no. That field had too many people. Rather, she should pursue study of the Mesopotamians. And as a woman, she did as she was told. Acquiring an advanced degree was something that was not done by a woman in her social world. She tried to keep it a secret from her friends, but the family cook was friendly with the cook for the Rothschilds across the street, and of course they gossiped among themselves, and Edith's secret studies soon became known to all her friends. When she actually achieved her doctorate in 1935, she was among the first women to do so. The official university stamp had to be altered by hand to indicate that the degree was conferred not upon a man, but upon a woman. Her pioneering dissertation was on the cylinder seals of the Akkadian period, circa 2250 BC. She traveled to Berlin in 1936 to work on a collection of seals and was so profoundly shaken by what she saw there that when she returned to Vienna, she warned her father that they should make plans to leave. He, however, felt that none of all that would affect them. Here she is on the balcony of the hunting lodge, an introspective image, perhaps contemplating her uncertain future. She rarely spoke about those times, but once she mentioned to me that she stayed up all night glued to the radio in anxious anticipation of the impending Anschluss. After the Anschluss, she was forbidden entry to the university, and at one point she was detained for over 24 hours. Her whereabouts and her fate were unknown to her distraught family and friends. After her release, she never, ever spoke about what happened during that time. The first time I learned about it was from her sister long after Edith's death. Their trusted, if forbidding governess joined the Nazi Party in order to provide a cover for the Porada household and her beloved charges. It was that party affiliation that enabled the governess to get Edith and her sister Hilda onto the train for their escape, as things in Vienna were rapidly deteriorating. Her father stayed back, but was stopped by a friend in the street and warned not to return home. All was abandoned. After her death, sorting through her papers, I came across two documents, both deeply moving in their own different ways. First is her passport that got her out. Note, she is referred to up here as Dr. Edith Porada. She's not accompanied with a husband and she has no children. The next page, it's professor of philosophy as her business, birthplace Vienna, average height, round face, brown hair, brown eyes, and there's the official stamp for her picture and her name, and then stamp, Vienna, September 14, 1938. On the next page, upper left, she's permitted to travel to France, Turkey, England, America, Hungary, and Bulgaria only for 1 year until September 14, 1939. The ruse was that she would return, stamped again. The next page, on the right-hand side, she goes to Berlin and gets a permit to visit France from the French embassy in Berlin. And the French permit is valid for only 2 months, from September 27th to November 27th, 1938. Again, the stamp as she finally leaves, October 9th, 1938, that's her exit stamp. And up in the upper right, October 9th, 1938, safely into France. While she was in Paris on November 7th, a German diplomat was assassinated. The next day, on November 8th, Edith Porada obtains a quota of immigration from the American consul in Paris. And finally, on November 9th, 1938, she embarks on a boat at Cannes as the events of Kristallnacht erupt as a retaliation for the German diplomat's assassination in Paris. All of this swirling around her, her future, and indeed her very existence in question. Eventually, she and her sister made it to New York. Her father fled through the East and was able to join them. He got a job in a box factory, and Hilda, her sister, was able to get secretarial work. What about Edith? The second document that I found is this humble and much frayed volume of illustrations for her dissertation. The text volume miraculously still survives in Vienna. One can imagine as she was leaving Vienna, not knowing what the future would bring, and officially, as far as the authorities were concerned, she was returning. She was restricted on what she could take with her. The art historian in her, Edith Porada, chose the volume of illustrations. She knew the text, she needed the images. This was filled with line drawings of seal impressions, all drawn by Edith Porada herself, hundreds of them, as well as a catalog of all the visual elements on the seals listed, again, all drawn by her. This was groundbreaking work of great detail, which would eventually serve as the foundation upon which she built her entire field of research and teaching method here in America. And it was this volume that she used as her so-called calling card to persuade Belle da Costa Greene to let her work on the Morgan Library seal collection. The Morgan Library was Edith Porada's scholarly home in America. She was the first curator of the Morgan seals. Her landmark publication of the Morgan's collection, worked on during the war years and finally published in 1948, remains today, after 70 years, a standard reference on seals and presented seals for the first time as art themselves and in an art book format. She made all new, carefully rolled impressions of the Morgan seals and photographed them herself in order to coax variations in the details in the seals through different creative lightings. A new world opened up for her in America. There were none of the prejudices against and amongst women of her class in the new world. She was starting over. She, her father, and sister moved into a small apartment not far from the Morgan, and they led a life completely different from that in Vienna. They dropped Rappaport Edler von and just used Porada as the family name. And Edith Porada began her now legendary career. She was safe and happy. And here she is, walking out of a delicatessen near the Morgan Library, her lunch in her hand, her camera over her shoulder, on the way to the Morgan. Edith Porada became the honorary curator of seals and tablets in 1957 and remained at the library until her death in 1994. She was a professor at Columbia University and gave weekly seminars at the Morgan Library. Here's with one of those students in Istanbul in 1986, not at the Morgan. At the Morgan, the students would gather in the Morgan's rather grand marble hall and then either descend by a back staircase or a rather rickety elevator to a cramped underground, underheated, and underfurnished room, which no longer exists. Lined with shelves piled with 8x10 photographic paper boxes and a gray, as well as a green steel utility locker. But then, out of the boxes would come impressions made by Dr. Porada of seals from around the world, such as the British Museum, Thebes, and Greece, of legendary collections such as the Foroughi collection from Tehran. And finally, out of her purse came a small change purse, from which was produced a key to the gray locker, and on the shelf of the gray locker was a small Sucrets tin that held another key. And with this key, the green locker was finally opened, and the students would gasp to behold the Morgan's collection of seals. We would be privileged to handle and examine the very seals themselves under the watchful eye of Dr. Porada. What a difference from those hours of studying the photos of impressions in books. Here were those magical objects in our very hands. She would encourage us to use magnification and to draw what we saw. For generations of students in discussing the art of ancient Western Asia, Dr. Porada always strove to present the objects not as old, isolated, or of little immediate relevance, but as vitally connected to a long tradition of visual expression. By creating their context and restoring their cultural significance, Edith Porada was able to establish a continuity between the past and the present, and thus enrich and inform our own times as well. Verlyn Klinkenborg wrote in the New York Times several years after her death, quote, "She awoke the past by her own commitment to it, to become the matrix where past and present converged. The seals remained entwined forever with her words," end of quote. Dr. Porada bequeathed to the library her books and papers. This is the working library of the foremost scholar in her field, accumulated and refined from over some 50 years. However, most important is her correspondence, which dates from the time she arrived in America from Austria in the fall of 1938. It is a history of the development and personalities of the field and is irreplaceable. When Dr. Porada accepted the award for Distinguished Archaeological Achievement of the Archaeological Institute in America in 1977, she said, quote, "I think that my main function has been and is to be an intermediary between knowledge and students, colleagues, and friends," end of quote. This statement is overwhelmingly borne out in the correspondence. Also part of the bequest are thousands of impressions of ancient seals Dr. Porada made from public and private collections around the world. To date, over 9,000 have been cataloged. This seal, a beautiful milky chalcedony shown at the top with an impression below, shows a stag leaping in a landscape, was the seal most closely associated with Edith Porada, and perhaps her favorite, because the stags reminded her of the hunting lodge of her family before the war. As for her family, her sister joined the Red Cross to help the war effort and was sent to Hawaii, where she married and settled for the rest of her life. Her father was also able to help the war effort with his knowledge of the mining industry in Eastern Europe. After the war, he was able to get the hunting estate back, which had been in the Russian zone and by some miracle was not deforested when the Russians withdrew. Every summer until her death, Edith and her sister went there. The house in Vienna had been used as a headquarters for the German secret police. And because of that, the family decided against any claims on the property. Her mother lived out the war years in the south of France and became involved in the fashion world and eventually worked in an art gallery. Edith and her sister did not become reconciled with their mother until after their father's death in the 1960s. Here, Edith at the left, her mother and sister in Hawaii. An uneasy peace was established between them. When I met the mother in her 90s, shortly before her death, she said to me, quote, "I have two angelic daughters, and in the scales of life, I come up owing," end of quote. A close friend of Dr. Porada's once told me that Edith had the career that she did partly in order to show her mother that there was a different path in life for a woman to take. Edith Porada once wrote, quote, "As I prepared the case for the 1991 exhibition of masterpieces in the Pierpont Morgan Library a few weeks ago, I gratefully thought of Miss Greene, who entrusted to a young unknown foreigner the work on the then greatest and finest collection of cylinder seals, paralleled only by the British Museum and the Louvre. I was quite conscious then of the fact that such a generous faith in an untried young scholar was possible only in the United States, and this I still believe." Thank you.